What's up?
Hey, Push Nation. Today, in honor of Mrs. Smith, I'm going to be showing off my two dogs, Henrietta and Kayla. I hope that they could replace some awesome Photoshop made by the previous group. But anyways, today we're going to be talking about Executive Order 9066 in the court case Korematsu versus the United States. But the discussion about these topics begins with World War II. By the 1930s, Japan was already the world's primary aggressor in foreign affairs, with its invasion of Manchuria in 1931. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would try to avert war with peaceful foreign policies, but his efforts would prove to be ineffective. In 1937, as another display of aggression, Japan invaded China, escalating tensions in the Pacific. Finally, when Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the stage was set for the catastrophic World War. One of the major steps that the United States took, even while neutral, was cutting off oil and other crucial supplies to the Japanese. Without these supplies, the Japanese looked for a course of action against the United States: Pearl Harbor. In the early hours of December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes carried out a bombing on U.S. ships stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The date would go down in infamy due to the deadly nature of the attack, with 2,400 Americans killed and another 1,200 wounded. The dehumanization of opposing cultures in times of war was prevalent during this time period. Through use of posters, advertisements, and similar propaganda, many of the American population began to think of the Japanese as savage, backwards thinkers, with ruthless fanaticism towards their emperor and government. In response to Pearl Harbor and harnessing this growing anti-Japanese sentiment, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. Keep in mind, though, that although we may be talking primarily about Japanese Americans, the executive order did apply to other ethnicities. Racial tensions during this time period were also directed towards Americans that descended from other Axis powers. Specifically, about 11,000 German Americans and 3,000 Italian Americans were affected by the order. But what exactly was Executive Order 9066? Well, here's Jessica to tell us about the rest.
Hey everyone! So, in summary, Executive Order 9066 called for the creation of Japanese internment camps, primarily on the West Coast, and the mandatory internment of Japanese Americans. Even before World War II, racial prejudice against Asian Americans incited much conflict among the American people, in many cases taking it to the congressional level, i.e. laws that didn't allow them to testify in a court of law, and laws prohibiting the ownership of land. In the early 1940s, with Japan joining the war, FDR feared for U.S. security within its own borders and questioned the loyalty of Japanese Americans across the country. The Commander-in-Chief commissioned a secret study to assess the possibility of major internal conflicts. The study stated, "There will be no armed uprisings of Japanese in the United States. For the most part, local Japanese are loyal to the United States, or, at worst, hope that by remaining quiet, they can avoid concentration camps or irresponsible mobs." End quote. Despite this evidence, FDR passed the executive order forcing all Japanese people into concentration camps. Notices were posted across Japanese American communities instructing residents how to report to the camps. Most ended up selling all of their assets for very low prices because they couldn't be sure of their return. In total, 10 camps were constructed, all of which varied in size. Larger camps existed in areas where the anti-Japanese sentiment was strong, most notably on the West Coast, where a little over 110,000 Japanese were relocated. It's worth noting that in Hawaii, where around one-third of the population at the time were Japanese, that only 1,600 were relocated. As for the living conditions, it is safe to say that they were worse than the normal American communities. Before being assigned to camps, Japanese Americans were often temporarily held in stables. Housing was rudimentary and cramped. Guard towers and sentries watched the camps 24/7. The summers came with intense heat and dust because the camps were in the middle of the desert, and the winters were certainly no better. and most of the inhabitants could not even prepare for these conditions due to the ambiguity of the notices.
Yeah, I think you missed a spot over here.
Oh, oops.
No, it's recording. Hey, Apish Nation. So, most Japanese Americans did not actively resist Executive Order 9066 and the institutions it gave rise to, but of course, someone had to try. And that someone was none other than Fred Korematsu, an American-born citizen of Japanese descent who refused to leave his home in San Leandro, California. Fred, like any other person who wrote the law, was convicted. His appeal eventually made its way up to the Supreme Court, where a 6-3 majority ultimately left Fred convicted. How could the Supreme Court let such a blatant disregard of civil rights pass their docket? I mean, it's not like they haven't done it before, Plessy, but still. As Justice Hugo Black said, although legal restrictions on a specific racial group must always be considered with extreme scrutiny, these restrictions aren't always unconstitutional. When there is a pressing need for such measures, such as in wartime, these restrictions are completely justified. Dissenting opinions, like those of Justice Frank Murphy, argued that the need for wartime security does not justify the utter stripping of civil rights which Fred went through. According to Murphy, the internment was not even based on the potential harm Japanese Americans could inflict, but rather was the byproduct of the disinformation, and I quote, the disinformation, half-truths, and insinuations that for years have been directed against Japanese Americans by people with racial and economic prejudices. Also on this side was the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. But no matter the arguments supporting Korematsu, 6 justices, who, by the way, were all appointed by FDR, shattered the lives of Korematsu and thousands like him.
Hey everyone. So, the 6-3 majority ruling in favor of the United States is yet another example of the federal government's power in foreign crises. In times of war, the United States has consistently shown that they are not afraid to push their boundaries and infringe on a few civil liberties here and there. Take, for example, the Alien and Sedition Acts, shanked the United States, and the Espionage Act. And the Supreme Court certainly did not deviate from this pattern in Korematsu versus United States, when they ruled that Korematsu's detainment and the executive order was constitutional. As you can imagine, this case's ruling has been highly controversial throughout the years. Whether this is a case of strong federal power or outright racial discrimination is still a subject of debate, but Justice Robert Jackson certainly thought the latter. In his dissenting opinion, Jackson condemned the ruling, saying that judicially justifying the executive order was worse than the actual executive order itself. Note that Korematsu versus United States would have repercussions beyond Japanese Americans. Similar reasoning would be used to justify the suspension of civil liberties during the Red Scare of the Cold War. As for the internment camps themselves, the United States government has retrospectively acknowledged some degree of wrongdoing. President Gerald Ford went on to formally eliminate Executive Order 9066, along with an apology to Japanese Americans. Jimmy Carter later designated a commission to investigate the internments, and concrete compensation for Japanese Americans finally arrived in 1988. The Civil Liberties Act awarded each detainee, or descendant of the detainee, $20,000 for a total of $1.2 billion. So, in summary, Japan's aggressive tendencies towards the United States during World War II added to pre-existing racial tensions and culminated in the passage of Executive Order 9066. The presidential order called for the mandatory internment of over 100,000 Japanese Americans, as well as more than 10,000 German and Italian Americans. In Korematsu versus United States, the Supreme Court upheld the order in a clear demonstration of federal power. Finally, the United States government would apologize and compensate decades later. Now, does this make up for the actions of the government? It's not really my place to say. But the executive order and resulting court case were a clear demonstration of federal power during wartime, and this power would become evident again during the Cold War. Clearly, the past shapes the future.
Thanks for watching, APUSH Nation. Bye! How could the Supreme Court let such a blatant disregard of civil rights pass their docket? I mean, it's not like they haven't done it before, Plessy, but still. As Justice Hugo Black said...
Did you get in the shot?
Hey, guys.
Hey, Bush Nation.
Okay, let's